Okay, so today's lecture is going to be on the Spanish-American War. So we've just got out of Unit 4 and 5. I know that was a long unit. So now we're in Unit 6. We're completely changing topics here. We're going to hit number 6 through 11 in Unit 6 in the packet. So just follow along and I'll try to cue you up as we get close. So we're starting off with Spanish in Cuba, or the Spain in Cuba, excuse me. So at this time, Cuba is a colony of Spain. So Spain is in control of Cuba at this time. They're using them for resources, sugar, a lot of different things. But the things that are going on there are a little questionable. So there are these accusations of atrocities, which means basically like human rights violations, things that are going on there that are not right, that are sort of taking advantage of the native Cuban people. And this is sort of getting to the U.S. U.S. is getting wind of it. And we're starting to sort of form opinions whether we want to go down there, do we not want to go down there, should we get involved. But they're also, the Cuban people are attempting to revolt in periods of time while Spanish is in control. So it's sort of showing that Cuba is also willing to fight for their own rights. In 1898, though, things start to really change. That's when we sort of started getting involved. So U.S. public opinion. So just like usual, the U.S. is fighting over sort of whether we should go to war or whether we should stay neutral. So keeping with that neutrality that Washington talked about in his farewell address. So we're still fighting over that, but the first thing that sort of starts changing the way people are thinking is the Delon letter, which is a letter written by a Spanish minister that was sort of intercepted, stolen from him, and published in a New York newspaper. And basically it was calling McKinley, who was the president at the time, sort of a coward. Sort of he was just pandering to the public and just sort of changes the U.S. perception of Spain and really starts seeing them more as a negative sort of empire and a negative country to have close to our borders. And then the thing that really starts changing public opinion is the USS Maine. So the Maine is a battleship that was sent to Cuba outside of sort of their jurisdiction, but it was close to Cuba. It was meant to sort of keep an eye on what's going on there, monitoring the situation with the revolt happening there, and just sort of maintaining that the U.S. is willing to step in if it's needed. But as we're down there, there's an explosion. So the USS Maine, there's an explosion somewhere underneath the ship. So the reports have said it was a submarine. Other reports say it was an explosion within the ship. So like just some kind of malfunction that caused an explosion. But the point is, the ship sank, killing like over 200 American soldiers and sailors. And it really turns the opinion of the U.S. public. So it's sort of seen as it was sunk. It wasn't really pushed that it might have been an explosion from within. But that's still, I mean, there's still people debating this to this day. But that's what really changed the public perception of our sort of involvement with Cuba and Spain in this revolt. And the U.S. is now going to get involved. So the reaction in the public back in those New York newspapers that we were talking about is yellow journalism. So for number 7. So yellow journalism is basically this idea of trying to sell papers no matter what the cost. So you don't need complete facts. You don't need a factual basis for your conclusions. Basically, your job is to sell as many papers as you can, sort of ignore the facts to an extent, and just try to get people to buy the stuff. Because there was a big sort of battle going on in the U.S. between two newspapers in New York City about sort of who was going to sell the most papers. And the way you sold papers was to sort of get people's attention, draw them in with the biggest sort of headlines, and that's what sort of yellow journalism was created through. So we're actually in the Spanish-American War at this time. So the U.S. has entered after the USS Maine. So we're going to jump in and we're going to solve this issue. So duration. So it was a pretty short war. So it's basically 3 months, and it was fought actually on Cuba, so on Cuban soil, and it was also fought in the Philippines, which Spain owned at this time as well. So we're fighting in two different areas. Mostly in the Philippines, it's naval battles. And Cuba, it's generally a land conflict. This is where you see the Rough Riders emerge. So the Rough Riders were a cavalry unit, so sort of the last really time you see cavalry really heavily used, even though they weren't really used even in this war. But this is where you see the emergence of Theodore Roosevelt, who is the guy on the horse right there. So our future president, so this is before he's president. No, it's a little confusing, but before he's president, he was a member of this cavalry unit and was sort of honored during this war. And this is where he really became well known. It's where he finally got his name on the national headlines and where he got his start eventually in politics. And so after this, so the U.S. wins the war with Cuba. So U.S. and Cuba win, defeat Spain, and it's called by many in the U.S. a splendid little war because, as you'll see, we get a lot of new territory from it. Didn't have to pay a lot, not a lot of deaths, which we'll talk about in just a second. And it just sort of turned out pretty well for the U.S. So deaths. So there were some deaths involved in this war. But the funny thing was, not a lot of them were from battle. Actually, a lot of them were from disease. So in this sort of subtropic climate down there, there's a lot of malaria, there's a lot of yellow fever, there's a lot of sort of things going on there that the U.S. citizens have not been exposed to or not immune to. So actually more people from the U.S. or U.S. soldiers die from that than they actually do in the battles. So so the U.S. wins even though we're sort of fighting these diseases and stuff. But what do we do? What do we do now? So we win. So what happens? So the first thing that happens. So for number 10, we're on the 1889 Treaty of Paris. So what happens from this sort of agreement was the U.S. gets control of Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. So they are now territories of the U.S. The U.S. is technically in control of them, and we are economically sort of benefiting from them as well. And Spain gets a small amount of money to sort of cede this land. So a little bit of a save face for the Spanish, and we sort of give them some money and basically act like we paid for it, even though sort of it was worth a whole lot more than what we paid. So Platt Amendment. So that was the first agreement. The Platt Amendment sets up an agreement between us and Cuba. So it's not dealing with Spain anymore. So it's in 1901, and it sets up our relationship with Cuba. So what it was called at the time is a protectorate. So this is the idea of we are sort of in control of Cuba. We have a say in their government, but we also are the military arm of their country. So if you mess with Cuba, you mess with the U.S. They're under our protection. So as you see in the picture there on the right, Uncle Sam with the American flag is sort of sheltering Cuba, which is sort of shown as that lady hunched over, sort of being with her hands together, being protected. And what this also sets up, which still stands to this day, is the Guantanamo Bay. So this is where the U.S. keeps a lot of suspected terrorists in Cuba. So even though we have this strained relationship with Cuba, we can't buy or sell Cuban goods in the U.S., or we're not supposed to at least. We actually still control Guantanamo Bay, which is on Cuba. And so we still maintain a little bit of that island for the U.S.'s use. So the last question, so number 11, America on the world stage now. So we finally entered the world stage. So what does this all mean? It means America is now an imperialistic nation, or we are an imperial country. So this idea of now we have little countries all over the world. So we have places where we have control. It's not just like the continental U.S. So it's not just, at this time, the 48 states, or even less. But it's not the 48 states now. It's also that we have, so we have Cuba now, which is close. We have Guam and Puerto Rico, which are relatively close. And then we have the Philippines, which are way off between Asia and Japan. So now we have our hand in a lot of different places in the world at this time, and are really starting to join the major powers in the world at this time, like England and France and a couple other countries who have little colonies all over the world. So that's all for today, and we will start again tomorrow.